The evening sun cast long shadows across the wildlife reserve as Alice stood before the lion's den, her heart thundering in her chest. 8 years had passed since she'd last seen Miracle, the lion she had raised from a cub, and the weight of their separation pressed heavily upon her. Her fingers trembled as she waited for the manager to unlock the gate, each second stretching into eternity. "He's different now," the manager warned, his voice heavy with concern. "Since you left, he's become territorial, aggressive. We can't even get close enough to feed him directly anymore. Are you sure about this?" Alice nodded, though uncertainty flickered across her face. She knew she had changed in the past 8 years. It stood to reason that Miracle had too. Yet she had to see him, had to know if any trace remained of the special bond they once shared. Their story had begun a decade earlier, during one of Alice's routine hiking sessions through the reserve's safer trails. As a staff member and passionate naturalist, she knew every path by heart, but that day brought something unexpected. Just off the main trail, she discovered a lion cub, barely alive and grievously wounded. A broken leg and a deep gash along his belly told a story of violence, though whether from poachers or predators, she never knew. The cub's whimpers of pain struck something deep within her. Without hesitation, she gathered him into her arms, his tiny form surprisingly light against her chest. Even in his wounded state, the cub seemed to sense her intentions, wrapping his paw around her finger with surprising strength. At the reserve's veterinary clinic, the staff worked tirelessly to save him. Throughout his treatment, Alice remained by his side, speaking softly to him through the long nights. The cub held on to life with remarkable tenacity, defying the odds with each passing day. It was this fighting spirit that inspired Alice to name him Miracle. As weeks passed, Miracle transformed from the pitiful creature she'd found into a playful, energetic cub. His recovery seemed almost supernatural, from learning to walk again to developing the confidence to attempt his first tiny roars. Alice became his primary caretaker, spending every possible moment with him. Mornings began with his enthusiastic greeting, and evenings ended with his reluctant goodbyes. Their bond deepened as Miracle grew into adolescence. Though he became too large for their earlier playful tumbling, they developed new ways to interact. Alice would read to him during quiet afternoons, and he would rest his massive head in her lap, purring with contentment. The other staff members marveled at their connection, how a full-grown lion could be so gentle with one human while remaining aloof or aggressive with others. However, their peaceful routine was shattered one night when a cobra escaped its enclosure and found its way into Miracle's den. The ensuing battle between lion and snake was fierce, with Miracle ultimately killing the cobra, but suffering a potentially lethal bite in the process. The reserve's supply of anti-venom had been depleted earlier that month, and a new batch would take 24 hours to prepare. Alice refused to leave his side as he fought for his life, her mind returning to that first day she'd found him. The manager suggested euthanasia to end his suffering, but Alice fiercely opposed it. "He's a fighter," she insisted, her voice breaking but determined. "He survived before, and he'll survive now." True to her faith in him, Miracle held on until the anti-venom arrived. His recovery marked another milestone in their relationship, a shared battle won through trust and determination. Yet fate had other plans for them. Alice's husband Brian, a prominent prosecutor, had recently secured a life sentence for a notorious crime boss. When threats were made against their lives by the criminal's organization, they were forced into witness protection with barely a night's notice. Alice had planned to say goodbye to Miracle the next day, but that chance was stolen from her. Instead, she vanished into the night, leaving behind no explanation for her sudden absence. The years in witness protection weighed heavily on Alice. While she built a new life under an assumed identity, her thoughts constantly returned to Miracle. She imagined him waiting for her each morning, growing confused and then despondent as days turned into weeks, months, and years. The manager's reports about his increasing aggression and isolation only intensified her guilt. Now, 8 years later, With the crime organization finally dismantled and the threats neutralized, Alice stood before Miracle's den. The manager's warnings echoed in her mind as she stepped inside. The den was darker than she remembered and larger. Or perhaps Miracle had simply grown even more in her absence. She heard him before she saw him, a low rumble that vibrated through the ground. Then he emerged from the shadows and Alice's breath caught in her throat. He was magnificent, larger than she remembered, his mane fuller and darker. But it was his eyes that held her attention. Eyes that had once been full of playful affection now regarded her with an unreadable intensity. "Miracle," she whispered, fighting to keep her voice steady. "It's me. It's Alice." The lion's muscles tensed, and he crouched slightly, a posture Alice recognized from her years of working with big cats. The crowd of onlookers gasped as Miracle prepared to pounce, but Alice stood her ground. If this was to be their final moment together, she would face it with the same courage she'd always seen in him. Miracle launched himself forward and Alice stumbled backward, falling onto the ground. The manager shouted for the tranquilizer gun, but before anyone could react, Miracle was standing over her. For a moment that seemed to stretch into infinity, they stared at each other. Then, slowly, the massive lion lowered his head and began to lick her face. His rough tongue was exactly as she remembered, and tears began to stream down her cheeks as she realized he remembered her too. All these years, through all the changes, their bond had endured. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed, wrapping her arms around his neck as far as they would go. "I'm so sorry I left you, but I'm back now, and I promise, I'll never leave you again." The transformation in Miracle was remarkable. Within weeks of Alice's return, his aggressive behavior subsided. He began accepting other caretakers again, though Alice remained his favorite. He even started socializing with other lions in the pride, as though her return had restored his faith not just in her, but in the world at large. Their reunion became a symbol at the reserve of the extraordinary bonds possible between humans and animals. Visitors would gather to watch Alice work with Miracle, marveling at how the supposedly aggressive lion turned into an oversized house cat in her presence. But for Alice and Miracle, it was simply a return to the way things should be. Two friends who had found their way back to each other against all odds. Years later, Alice would often sit beside Miracle's den in the evening, just as she had when he was a cub. Though they were both older now, their bond remained undiminished. In those quiet moments, as the sun set over the reserve and Miracle's content purring rumbled through the air, Alice would reflect on the true miracle of their story, not just his survival against the odds or even their dramatic reunion, but the simple, profound capacity for love to bridge any distance, survive any separation, and overcome any obstacle. As for Miracle, he never let Alice out of his sight during her visits again. Perhaps he understood, in his lion's heart, that some bonds are simply meant to last forever.